Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Tara Kiran. I'm a family doctor at the St. Michael's Hospital Academic Family Health Team and the Vice Chair for Quality and Innovation at the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Toronto. I'm delighted to be your moderator today for our session on changing the way we work on COVID vaccines. We're pleased to host these sessions with the Ontario College of Family Physicians, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Liz Mugga, the president of the OCFP, to open it up.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tara. And yes, delighted to be here and partnering with the University of Toronto DFCM. We have an incredible panel for you. They will have a chance to introduce themselves in just a moment, and to note that this session is accredited, and you will get an email about that after the session to be able to claim those credits. And I'll start with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands on which we are hosting this meeting include the traditional territories of many nations. The OCFP and DFCM recognize that the many injustices experienced by the Indigenous people of what we now call Canada continue to affect their health and well-being. The OCFP and DFCM respect that Indigenous people have rich cultural and traditional practices that have been known to improve health outcomes. I invite all of us to reflect on the territories you are calling in from as we commit ourselves to gaining knowledge, forging a new culturally safe relationship, and contributing to reconciliation. And I am calling in from Ottawa, which is the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. I'll hand back to you, Tara.
Yeah, so the land acknowledgement is also always a good time to reflect on injustices perpetrated towards Indigenous people, past and present. And, it's been great to see that they have been prioritized for vaccine distribution. But I know some of my colleagues have been vocal about how urban Indigenous populations may have been or have been left behind to date. On the silver lining, or the good news, is that we heard directly from MACAT last session about the Operation Remote Immunity, where many of Indigenous communities in the North are starting to get the vaccine, which is a really hopeful sign. Next slide. So we're delighted to bring you our sessions, which are really about learning and sharing from each other. If you want to check out past sessions, please do go onto our website. These sessions are now credited for self-learning as well. Next slide. We do have a planning committee that selects all of the speakers and designs the sessions, and we always welcome your input, and you'll receive an evaluation at the end and tell us what you think. Next slide. So today I'm just delighted to have, we have another great panel. We've got some folks from Northern Ontario, some from here in Toronto, to give us perspective on what family doctors can do in different communities, and also how we can build vaccine confidence. Next slide. And of course, we've got some return guests as well as our co-hosts, Liz Mugga and Dave Kaplan. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to people one at a time to introduce themselves and speak to their disclosures. Sarah?
Thanks so much, Tara. So my name is Sarah Newberry. I'm a rural generalist family physician in the community of Marathon, where I've been for the past 25 years, and it's a pleasure to be joining you today. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose and will receive a speaker's honorarium for this. And I'm going to pass it to my local teammate, Michelle Lajeunesse. Michelle?
My name is Michelle Lajeunesse, and I am the Community Health Promotion Coordinator at the Marathon Family Health Team. And I have been here for over 5 years now, and I have no conflicts of interest to disclose.
Sabina?
Hi, my name is Sabina Borja-Miller. I am the co-founder of the Borja-Miller Foundation and the South Asian Health Network. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose.
Daniel?
Hi, Daniel Warshawski. I'm a public health physician in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, and I also have no conflicts of interest to disclose.
David?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm David Kaplan. I'm a family doctor and the Chief of Clinical Quality at Ontario Health in our Clinical Institutes and Qualities Program branch. No financial relationships, but I do receive an honorarium from the OCFP.
Liz?
Good morning. So Liz Mugga, and I receive a stipend from the Ontario College for my role as president, and otherwise I have no conflicts to declare. Thank you.
I'm Tara Kieran, and I do a lot of research, and so do have some grants and salary support that I've disclosed there. The only one from a for-profit company is from Gilead Sciences for a grant to cure Hep C. Next slide. So we're delighted to welcome all of you, many of you from the GTA, but so many of you from outside the GTA, and it's always fantastic to see that attendance. Next slide. We really designed these sessions based on your feedback and your questions. And, you know, we have had upwards of 700 people join these sessions more recently on vaccines. And of course, we can't get to every question live. So you had pre-submitted questions, and based on sort of the themes that arose, these are the 5 questions that we really commit to answering today that we'll be focusing on. We'll be talking about, you know, the other vaccines that will be available soon and how they work. We'll certainly be talking about building vaccine confidence for different communities, addressing concerns. We'll be giving an update on the rollout plan, what this means for you, especially if you're a community family doctor, what it means for you to get the vaccine and also give the vaccine. There were some specific questions that people had about delays in the dosing and also the effectiveness of the vaccine against new strains. So these are the top questions that we received that we'll make sure that we address during the session. Next slide. I will say that we aren't going to be able to address all your questions necessarily about the mRNA vaccine safety and efficacy itself. We have had past sessions that focus on that, and I direct you to looking at those past sessions or some of the resources that we posted here. Next slide. I see that many of you are already familiar with how to ask questions because we've already gotten quite a few in our Q&A box, but that is where we ask you to direct your questions. Please put them in the Q&A box. If you have a comment to share or a resource to share, you're welcome to use the chat to share that. But please put the questions in the Q&A box. And in addition to answering some of the questions live, some of our panelists like David Kaplan, Liz Muga, and others will be going into the Q&A box to answer them in a typed form. And you can look at the answered questions as well. And I suggest you do that before you put your own question in. So that it helps us if you're able to use the thumbs up. So if you see a question that you really like, that you want to have answered, please put a thumbs up because we do prioritize the questions that many people have prioritized as important. Next slide. So without further ado, I'm really excited to turn it over to our first set of panelists, Dr. Sarah Newberry and Ms. Michelle Jeunesse. So Sarah and Michelle, I know you guys have been doing a lot of work up in Maryland and your family health team to prepare for giving the vaccine to your community. So we look forward to hearing more about your journey doing that. I'm going to turn it over to you. Next slide.
Thanks so much, Tara. And maybe I'll begin by simply saying that although Michelle and I are here representing our team, it really has been a whole team effort with leadership in various ways by many of our team members, and we're really happy to be here today to represent them. We'll go to the next slide, which I wanted to share simply to paint a bit of a picture of our context. Rural Northern Ontario is vast. It's 1,500 kilometers from Temiskaming Shores in the east to Kenora in the west. It spans 2 time zones. But many of our small rural communities across Northern Ontario actually have some specific similarities. This is our healthcare setting. It's quite integrated and largely integrated through the family physicians who serve it. In the top right of the slide, you'll see our small acute care hospital. We'll just go back to that. Thanks, Brian. Our small acute care hospital that also has a complex chronic care wing. In the bottom left is our seniors supportive housing, and the majority of rural communities do have some kind of seniors congregate housing, either long-term care or a senior supportive housing like we have. And in the bottom right of the slide is our clinic. Our clinic is on the top floor of that building. And the assessment center that we run through primary care is on the bottom right of that whole building. And part of what I want people to understand is that really it is the same group of family physicians who are providing care in all of these settings, both in hospital, inpatient care, emerge, obstetrical care, providing and supporting care in our senior supportive housing, running the assessment center and our primary care setting. And we'll go to the next slide. It's really important, I think, understanding that our human resources are quite limited, and we're fortunate in Marathon. We have 9 family physicians here. We have more than the majority of small rural communities do. But that fragile human resource stretched across many settings to deliver care, and without opportunity really to bring other clinicians in a rapid way, creates a fragility to our healthcare system that is really important and is experienced by many rural communities. Thank you, Brian. In this slide, you'll see that from Perth, just outside of Ottawa, to Northwestern Ontario, there is concern about the impact of COVID-19 on rural communities. And there is concern about the lack of information about rural vaccine rollout. The Society of Rural Physicians of Canada has called for some national strategy around rural vaccine rollout, in part for long-term care, but also in part to protect the fragile human resources that serve these communities. In the bottom left of this slide, you'll see that Australia, like many countries, does actually have a national strategy for rural and remote communities. And I think that that's certainly something that all of us would find helpful. So we'll go to the next slide, leaving that slide about what we don't know. We don't know when we're going to receive vaccine in our communities. We don't know when that will happen, but we do know what we can focus on. And here in Marathon, like many communities, we're focused on how we can decrease vaccine hesitancy. And we're using the World Health Organization framework that looks really at 3 components. One is complacency, and complacency about the disease itself. The second component is convenience of access to vaccine. And the third is confidence in the vaccine. When we think about complacency, we know from many studies and commentaries about the rural US that there's a high level of complacency, particularly around the way in which vaccine contributes to the common good. I don't think we have quite that level of complacency in rural Canada, but we don't have quite as much information about that. So we're focused here on the 2 elements of convenience and how we can create convenient, rapid access to the vaccine when we receive it, and how we can continually message the community to support them to feel confident about the vaccine when it arrives. And I wanted to highlight that one of the things that we've done to create convenient access to flu vaccine in our communities has been to deliver it in home through our home and community care staff and through our community-based paramedics. But we know that with the Moderna vaccine, we actually won't be able to do that same kind of in-home delivery of vaccine for those who will struggle to come to the clinic and who would certainly struggle to come to a larger vaccine clinic in the community. So we have some work to do to think about how we enable convenient access for those who struggle with mobility and being able to leave their own residences. So I'm going to turn it to Michelle now to talk a little bit about some of the communication strategies that we're using and some of the ways that we are trying to enhance convenient access. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So the main communication tools that we've been using, just like many other rural communities, are our local radio station and newspaper, and also our family health team's website and Facebook page. And we've been using these media outlets as part of our health promotion communication strategy for over 5 years now. So we did have a good starting point prior to the pandemic. And now most of the information that we share is related to COVID and the vaccine. And Sarah will post the link to our website in the chat for those of you who are interested in taking a look at our resources. And part of our communication strategy as well is to ensure that we're sharing the same message across all platforms. So for example, when we started sharing information about the vaccine, we developed an FAQ sheet that was sent to the newspaper. It was updated to our website, and we had vaccine questions of the day posted on our Facebook page, and we had an interview about it on the radio. And all this was happening on the same week. So the idea here is that no matter where our patients are looking for information that's coming from us, they're receiving that same consistent messaging. And we're also able to reach different demographics as well. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Now I'll just share a little bit of information about our local vaccine plan. I think it's important to recognize that Early on, we recognized that as a primary care organization, we were in an ideal position to lead our local vaccine planning efforts. And just like many other rural communities, our entire population are patients of our family health team. So we do have the advantage of having all the information that we need through our EMR, which makes things much easier from a planning standpoint. So once it was decided that we would lead, we began our vaccine planning process. And a helpful tool that we used in the early stages was the ministry's vaccine planning checklist that you can see on the left side of the screen. And Sarah will post the link to that checklist in the chat as well. So by using this resource and our previous experience with vaccine administration, we were able to develop a plan that you see on the right of your screen that clearly outlines the roles of our internal staff, so our admin staff and healthcare providers, as well as our external partners, so like the hospital and our health unit, for example. And as well, when we were developing this plan, one of our main priorities was to utilize the resources that we have available in our facility to efficiently and effectively vaccinate our population. And we took this approach because we don't anticipate having a mass immunization. So instead, we created a vaccination clinic schedule that includes multiple 2 to 3 hour immunization clinics that are spread across a 5-day period. And using this strategy would allow us to administer about 1,500 vaccines or more if need be in that 5-day period. Next slide, please. Now, to help with our vaccine planning process, we began to distribute and collect vaccine consent forms, starting with the priority groups identified by the Ministry of Health. And to do this more efficiently, we created an e-consent form. The link to this form can be distributed quite easily, and we believe that the convenience of being able to complete the consent form from home will encourage more of our patients to complete them in advance.
I think you can end slides there, Brian. Thanks so much. So thank you, Michelle and Sarah, for really sharing your perspectives from the Northern community. And I think there's lots that no matter what community where we work in that we can take away. I think just as you don't know when you're going to be receiving the vaccine in Marathon, there are many communities across Ontario where that's the same thing. And it's been great to see, example of how you've prepared despite that uncertainty and how you're using the communication channels available to you. And so we saw something similar when Maycat spoke last time, that they're also doing a radio show up north for many of the Indigenous communities that are more remote, and really fantastic to kind of see that kind of public communication by family doctors for members of their community. So we already have so many questions from you guys in the Q&A, many of which our panelists have already started to answer. So I'm just going to read a few here that I think stood out. So, someone asked, once a patient is vaccinated, can they socialize with others who have also been vaccinated? One of her 80-year-old patients asked her this, and so Daniel Warshawski replied that at this time, even individuals who are vaccinated should continue to follow all public health measures. So that includes social distancing, masking, hand hygiene, etc. And socializing with people outside the household is still discouraged. So it's a really important point there. Another physician asked have they've heard conflicting advice about how long to wait after a COVID vaccine booster before administering a routine vaccination, for example, tetanus. Is it 2 weeks, 4 weeks? And so Daniel Warshawski said that the recommendation is to wait 2 weeks after another vaccine before receiving a COVID vaccine. And then you should wait 4 weeks after receiving the COVID vaccine before receiving another vaccine, unless it's needed specifically for post-exposure prophylaxis, I believe. And then David Kaplan actually added that TB testing is not included in that, so it's not a vaccine, and TB testing does not need to be delayed per the WHO. So that's a couple of questions I think that a lot of people had. So check out the answered sections for more on that. There was another question that I thought, is related to long COVID. So a physician asked, I have a patient suffering from long COVID for 10 months. Is it safe for her to get a COVID vaccine, 1 or 2 doses? So I believe the answer is yes, but maybe I'll turn it over to you, Daniel, to answer that question.
Sorry, Tara, I was just typing some answers in the question and answer. Can you just repeat the question for me? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. So Naomi Ekup said, I have a patient suffering from long COVID for the last 10 months. Is it safe for her to get a COVID vaccine, 1 or 2 doses?
Yeah, so at this point, we have limited evidence specifically in people suffering from long COVID. However, from the data we do have, we don't see any reason that they should not be vaccinated. So for everybody who's currently in a priority group, we do recommend they receive the vaccine, really unless they have a significant allergy to the vaccine. That would be the primary reason not to have a dose. So I would encourage them to go for vaccination.
Thanks, Daniel. So I think, we're getting a lot more questions about long COVID, and I wanted to just highlight that on February 19th, our next community of practice, we actually will have Trish Greenhall from the UK joining us, which is going to be a real treat. And she's, been part of the guideline development around treatment of long COVID in the UK. And so we're going to have a robust discussion about that in a couple of weeks. Then I think there's another question you wanted to answer live, David Kaplan. So I'm just going to read that question out. So it's from Anne Sorensen. I have heard that once family docs are able to vaccinate their patients in the office, that the vaccine administration data must be entered in a system called COVAX that is not integrated with any EMR, so the data must be entered twice, along with extra information required by the system. Is there a plan to streamline this, as likely family doctors will receive very little remuneration for vaccinating their patients?
Yeah, so I'm happy to answer that. So at this time, so there is a platform called COVAX. So every dose of COVID vaccination is not just recorded, like i.e. which patient's getting it, but actually the inventory, the provincial inventory is tracked via COVID, which is obviously really important. We also track things like how much wastage of vaccine there are at individual sites, or vaccine that actually arrived spoiled, for instance. So every dose of COVID vaccination moving forward will have to be entered into COVAX. That is the decision that the government and at quite the sort of most senior levels has made for the purpose of having a successful campaign. Also knowing at the end of the day where we'd have to do very focused efforts in phase 3 to ensure that our vulnerable populations are vaccinated. Because, if we look at other countries already that have done a really good job and gotten 30 or 50% of their population vaccinated, it's starting to trail off. They're starting to lose weight. They're starting to have wasted doses at the end of clinic because the mad rush of people who obviously wanted the vaccine happens early on. With regard to EMR integration, one of the things that many primary care leaders across the province have really asked for is at least a notification via hospital report manager that your patient has received the vaccine, much like we get a notification with regard to COVID testing or positive COVID tests. Once you do have access, however, to COVAX, because you'll be part of the clinic, or even if you already have access because you're immunizing, for instance, in York Region in long-term care, you can actually search COVAX and find out all of your patients that have currently been immunized. So hopefully a one-way integration, meaning once the data is in COVAX, it'll be pushed to our EMRs, but definitely not in scope to have us enter data into our EMR and then push that data out of the EMR into COVAX.
Thank you so much, David. So I'm going to take one more question before we go to our next panelist, and that one's from Jade Duncombe. So it says, a popular question: what is the role for antibody testing? So this is a question for you, Daniel Warshawski. I've had several nurses asking for testing. They pay through Life Labs. How do we interpret negative results after they've had vaccination? Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a really good question. So at this point in Ontario, there are really only 2 clinical indications for antibody testing. And so that's for children who might be presenting with multi-inflammatory syndrome, or for people who are severely ill in hospital, and serology might help with the clinical diagnosis. At this point, there is no indication for antibody testing post-vaccination. The antibody testing that we have is not necessarily specific enough to identify for the vaccines. and we don't really have numbers on the titers. So we do have evidence from the trials on seroconversion in the vast majority of people, but there's no reason to be doing it. If somebody used kind of a commercially available antibody test and it came up negative a few weeks after the vaccine, we wouldn't really know how to interpret that at this point, frankly. So we would recommend that people are not doing that.
Thanks, Danielle. So, we have been receiving a lot of questions about vaccine, how to build vaccine confidence. We know that vaccine confidence is an issue, especially with COVID vaccines being new. People, of course, have lots of questions. And then, layer that on top of some people's distrust of the medical science, of the scientific community and scientific institutions. And we know that hesitancy, is actually more, has some interesting layers and is probably more prevalent in some racialized communities for good reasons, for historical reasons. Those communities have been treated negatively and unethically in the past and do have more distrust of systems, and often that leads to more distrust of vaccines. So Sabina, you have been doing a lot of work to try and really counter vaccine hesitancy, to build confidence, to get the information out there to people. And I'm wondering if you could speak to us a little bit about kind of what are the top concerns you're hearing? How do you address them? How are those concerns different for people in racialized communities?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, great question. So I think I want to start by explaining that vaccine hesitancy is a spectrum. So you have your hardcore anti-vaxxers that very little you say can actually help with. But then you have another bucket that is your general hesitancy. These are usually people that are vaccine hesitant with perhaps one, maybe two vaccines. You'll see it often with influenza vaccine or with HPV specifically. A lot of times you'll see it with new parents wanting to delay or space their vaccines. So these are generally people who just have questions and need those questions addressed for them to feel comfortable. And then you have a third bucket, which are racialized communities that have distrust with health and government agencies due to a long and painful history of racism, discrimination, experimentation that they've also experienced very often firsthand in healthcare. So I think it's important to remember that a one-size-fits-all doesn't necessarily always work, and nuanced and tailored approaches are really important. But I think the one thing that exists across the board is we really should not be dismissive of fears and anxieties, because, of course, within our echo chamber, we know that vaccines are overwhelmingly safe and protective. And so our first reaction generally is to sideline concerns. But this does not necessarily instill confidence. And often, I spend a lot of time countering vaccine disinformation online on social media. And we often get questions on vaccines because people are too afraid of asking their family doctor because they don't want to be thought of poorly or judged. But it's something that I strongly encourage because people trust their family doctors, and family doctors have such an incredible impact and ability to move the needle. And so I just wanted to, obviously this is not something I have to tell this group, but it bears repeating, be empathetic, be kind, be respectful, and also don't drown people in data and jargon, because you tend to lose them if you start with something very heavy. The important thing to do is to ask questions so you're actually addressing the exact concern. And this is where you will see some of the questions coming up in racialized communities can be very different. And so we've been doing a lot of that with the South Asian Health Network. We're having these discussions with our communities, in addition with several BIPOC organizations and their community ambassadors. And some of the questions we're receiving from BIPOC and racialized communities are really, frankly, hard-hitting. So, the questions we've gotten in past vaccine town halls are people say that they feel like they're guinea pigs being experimented on. Others have actually said that the government is using the vaccine to exterminate or kill low-income and racialized people. And this came up in several different vaccine information sessions. And then, of course, you have the other side where people, in hard-hit areas of Ontario have said they feel left out because the vaccines are not coming to them fast enough, and they feel they're continuing to put their lives at risk every single day, going to work in an essential frontline role without many protections and workers' benefits. Overwhelmingly, they feel they're they feel let down by the government and public health. So many remember distinctly how difficult it was for them to collect race-based data on how COVID was disproportionately affecting their communities, but then this took months to begin collection here in Ontario. And even then, it's not being done across the board now. And many are also upset at being constantly blamed. So first we had no data, but then we had data, and now they're being vilified for having high transmission rates, even though we understand these are generally due to structural barriers that they face. And now they feel like they're being blamed and labeled as being vaccine hesitant when they feel health agencies, et cetera, are not acknowledging their role in causing some of this distrust. So, saying something such as Health Canada considers the vaccine safe doesn't necessarily mean much when they have that general distrust with government, Health Canada, or public health, and they feel that these government bodies have not done much to keep them safe during COVID. However, what does work is you telling them that you, as their family doctor, that you consider the vaccine safe and that you will be getting the vaccine when offered, will likely go much further because they have that trust and that relationship with you. They don't necessarily have that trust and relationship with the public health body. So I think that it's really important to recognize the important role that you play in their lives. Secondly, many multicultural and ethnic groups have very specific questions and concerns. So for instance, we're seeing a lot in the South Asian communities. We have questions coming up on whether the vaccines have any cow or bovine material because, it's considered holy for us. And then we have in our Muslim communities, people asking us whether the vaccines have any pork or whether it's halal or not. And again, these are very simple and easy to address questions that very often build confidence as you're able to answer these. And then the other thing about culturally sensitive messaging is also understanding how to engage with that specific community. So again, bringing it into the South Asian context, we've made several pieces on the basis of protecting your elders because this seems to resonate really well within our communities. And then, shortly I'll show you a poster that we created, actually has my father in it, where we talk about protecting your elderlies, and it actually has been so well received, and we received great feedback from all of our community members with respect to it, opening that dialogue and having that discussion. So to summarize what we're doing, we're creating a lot of culturally sensitive materials. We're making sure that they're accessible, especially in a variety of different languages. We're using tons of different formats. So sometimes, it could be a video, it could be infographics, it could be, things that we're doing on different mediums as well. So we're trying to ensure that we're actually getting information out in mediums that people are consuming. So for the South Asian population, we have a large percentage who are truck drivers, for instance. And so we're actually using ethnic radio that we know they listen to when they're driving to get those little sound bites in on a regular and consistent basis. So they're constantly hearing those messages coming in through them to drown out some of that anti-vax and rhetorics that are being spread around. We're also partnering with lots of BIPOC organizations because that bi-directional sharing of information is so incredibly important. So we share our materials with them, and they share with us what they're hearing directly from their community members because they have that ear to the ground with respect to what's going on with their specific communities. And we're also using this collaboration, beginning vaccine town halls with community health centers, and we're actually focusing them on specific cultural and ethnic groups. And that's basically just to encourage that open dialogue in a safe space without any judgment, where people can ask their questions, whatever their questions are, whatever they're thinking about, and they will be patiently answered by members within their own communities. And I think that also goes a long way in developing that trust and that relationship. Actually, Brian, if you could pull up the slides, that would be great. So this slide basically is, if you wanted more information, I've written quite a few op-eds on vaccine hesitancy and confidence and how do you build it. These are just, this is just a clip of some of the op-eds I've written recently. Next slide, please. These are resources I've made through unambiguous science. I'm trying to make things in a more fun and more accessible way. You can find these on my blog. Next slide, please. And so these are materials we're creating in collaboration with the South Asian Health Network. And what you'll see over here, we're really, if you look at the middle panel, what you'll see is that we're really trying to hone into the whole concept of the vaccine protecting you and your loved ones. We're also making sure, if you look at the Mythbusters, we're not amplifying any of the myths. So we're not putting the myth up in center. We're actually making sure that we're using our space to counter that as opposed to amplifying the myth. And on the right-hand side, you'll see that we've actually converted this into several different languages. Next slide, please. And this is the question we were getting very often in the beginning with respect to what were in the vaccines and whether there were any animal products or any blood or fecal products. And again, we've converted these into several different languages too. Next slide, please. And so this is the poster that I was talking about. That's my dad right there. And you know, the little block that you see, it's in Hindi, and it says, basically, protect your elders, get vaccinated. And this is one of the posters that we created in the early days, and it had, it really resonated and had so much traction. And my dad's become semi-famous now, so it's kind of cool as well. But I think these are the end of the slides. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sabina. I love that poster of your dad. It was really heartwarming. It was heartbreaking, though, to hear about those myths that, you know, and the views that so many members of racialized communities have about the, you know, potential negatives of the vaccine and the reasons for it. And it's great to see you and your colleagues just really trying to tackle those head on. And again, I think we're seeing creative use of different kinds of media. Love that you guys too are using, for example, radio. And I just to plug for Sabina's site, Unambiguous Science. So if you haven't checked out Unambiguous Science, please do. There's lots of really patient-friendly materials there that you can share with your patients to explain the vaccines and counter some of the most common myths. Some of the other materials that Sabina referred to will be available, I think, on the South Asian Health Network website shortly, and we'll circulate that link as well. So there, I think we're going to go to a couple more questions for our panelists, and then I think one question that's there near the top is, you know, relates to the latest on the vaccine distribution rollout. And so I think Arpana Mathur is asking, is there any clarity on which vaccine family doctors will be giving out at our clinics and when? And maybe David Kaplan, I'll turn it over to you to answer that question.
Well, I was going to let Dan speak to it.
Oh,
maybe.
okay, yeah.
I'll add that he's the expert this morning.
Sure. Thanks for the handoff, David. Yeah, so at this point, we still have pretty limited supply of vaccine overall. Moderna has been coming in as expected, but we all know that Pfizer has been delayed. And I'll talk about it a bit, but we're still waiting for any other vaccines to be approved. So in terms of which vaccines, which type will be given out in your clinics, we can't say for sure. I can be pretty confident it's not Pfizer, given the significant logistical challenges for that one. But you know, other ones like Moderna are stable fridge for a month at a time, so it could be Moderna. It's really going to be dependent probably on every local region. So every public health unit is coordinating their own vaccine rollout, and then the supply as it comes in. You know, realistically, we probably aren't going to be seeing huge rollout through primary care clinics for another couple months at least, until we have, again, a better sense of supply and we move past our kind of initial phase 1 priority groups. But it will be, I can't emphasize this enough, it's going to be driven locally by the local needs in terms of population distribution and high-risk groups that are in there. David, you probably have some operational thoughts on it though.
Yeah, so I think that we need to distinguish between, you know, our individual, you know, solo dyad, one physician, 2 or 3 physician clinics, and the opportunity for primary care providers to partner with public health or your local Ontario health team for being part of a larger vaccination clinic once phase 2 starts. So I would definitely try to reach out to your primary care leaders, depending on where you live. Definitely primary care, family doctors, nurse practitioners this week have started to have a dialogue, for instance, with Toronto Public Health, to help with implementation and figure out what this looks like, once we start getting more vaccine. But I think there's that distinction between, a fridge stable Johnson & Johnson's approved vaccination, which would be more similar to a flu shot distribution, and what we have approved now, and the need to be able to vaccinate segments of the population. The one thing I would say, which I think is really important, that's gotten lost, and not that the equity argument is not very important, and Sarah and colleagues are on the call, but a lot of people are very stuck in their mind that we have this very distributed population in Ontario. And while we definitely have an equity lens that we have to apply, and we are, and if we look at what we're doing already with Indigenous Canadians and vaccine, it's a perfect example. But I think we have to remember that we're actually somewhat lucky in Ontario compared to other provinces. 96% of our population lives along the 401. And so from a distribution standpoint, to larger centers, it's actually not a huge issue. I think the main issue, as we've heard time and time again, is just volume of vaccines that we have. I think once we get a good supply of vaccination, primary care, pharmacists, the whole kitchen sink will be involved in getting them into arms.
Can I just add a little bit?
Something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add a little something to that, to piggyback on that story. And I guess I would say, we're hearing, so is that it's going to go from a trickle to a flood. And when that flood happens, we are going to be vaccinating, everywhere. We're having lots of conversation at the provincial level with public health units and leaders, the chiefs in those public health units, and they understand the need to partner with family doctors. That's really clear to them, that they're going to need us, that we know what we're doing, that we can reach these populations. So I think that's been really encouraging. I think Kieran Moore, as a public health doctor, being on the COVID vaccine table now has been great. He's done great things locally in Kingston. So we're happy about him bringing that to the table as an example of where family doctors have really been an integral part of the rollout. And I think the stories that I'm seeing, in my role across the province are encouraging too, whether it's Marathon or York or Ottawa, or about family doctors starting to partner right now, going into retirement homes, helping with, really those key vulnerable populations. So I think those are some encouraging things. And I think the in our own offices, giving it out the way we do with flu shots will be in phase 3, but I have no reason to believe that that's not going to happen, and that we're really going to need to be participating actively in that. And all the conversations we're having now, how important that is for building vaccine confidence, and when that time comes, that it's actually in our individual offices. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
The only other thing I'd add, and I'll post a study in the chat, Dr. Jack Westfall has published in Annals of Family Medicine, who's a colleague, those of us who maybe go to a NAPCRG meeting or are involved in patient-centered research in family medicine. He published, well, it's in preprint and I'll post it, but the role of primary care and vaccine distribution in the United States, and only about 46 or 50% of vaccines are given by primary care in the States, and they've identified that they need primary, and I think it's upwards of 85% of vaccines are given by primary care in Canada, and so much more so, we are the experts in at the last mile in giving out vaccinations, and that's the message that I think all of your leaders have been giving to public health units.
Thank you, David and Daniel and Liz. I'm going to turn it over now to you, Daniel, to speak a little bit about the new vaccines that are upcoming, because I know people have lots of questions about that. So Brian, if you could put up Daniel's slides. You can go ahead, Daniel.
Great. Thanks so much. So, oh, wonderful. Sorry, I know this slide has a lot of stuff on it, but just to give everybody a general sense of what's going on, there's obviously a lot of research going to COVID vaccine even now. And so this is just a quick summary of some of the candidates that are currently in at least the phase 3 part of their trials, in order that we're hoping to see come, at various phases pretty soon, so that they can be used in terms of our vaccination program. Obviously, Pfizer and Moderna are the two that are approved right now for use in Ontario, but a couple other ones have been approved in other jurisdictions. So we've all heard of Sputnik in Russia, and some of the Sinovac ones are being used in China. Of most interest is realistically AstraZeneca, which is already approved for use and being used in the United Kingdom, and it's probably what we'll see coming up next in Canada. It's with Health Canada right now for approvals, so we're waiting to see, and frankly expecting in the next couple of weeks to hear that it has been approved. Johnson & Johnson or Novavax are probably the two that are closest behind that one. They have been submitted to Health Canada. However, they are further behind the process, so we don't have a good timeline of when they're going to be approved. So again, this is just to give a general sense of what we're seeing. So let's go to the next slide. This is just a very quick summary of Pfizer and Moderna. I won't take the time to talk about them now. We've all seen it. At this point, it really is just the numbers. Almost 800,000 doses of Pfizer and 350,000 doses of Moderna have been distributed across Canada. So we're doing pretty well with distribution so far on these ones, even despite the significant logistical challenges for them. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So this is what I want to run through quickly. So these are, as I just mentioned, the 3 vaccines that are currently with Health Canada waiting for approvals that we are expecting to see at some time soon. And again, AstraZeneca is furthest along. The AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are both adenoviral vectors. It's a different technology than the mRNA, but functioning on the same principles. Instead of just straight mRNA, it's the adenovirus delivering genetic material that's then used to create spike protein. The Novavax is different. It's actually a spike protein itself that's being directly administered. So the production is different than we see for the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. AstraZeneca, we've seen a lot of the news reports, and we do have the actual data from the studies now about the efficacy. So the initial reported efficacy was in the 60% range, except for that one strange trial that happened in Brazil from an error with the half dose and full dose. That coupled with some of the other interesting ways that they chose to do the trial. Among the sites, they essentially had multiple different RCTs instead of kind of a large multi-site RCT. So the analysis was slightly different than what we'd expect. Is part of the reason that it's actually taken this long to get approval in Canada. The FDA in the US has actually said they're not even going to be looking at approval of AstraZeneca until March. So there is some question about the validity of the results. However, even with that, let's assume that we have a 70% efficacy or around there, which is probably reasonable given the data we have right now. It's still a useful vaccine for us to have available. The real question is, who should be getting a vaccine that's only 70% efficacious as opposed to the 95% efficacious ones that we have? And so a big part of the prioritization process that's going to go forward once that is approved is determining what population is really going to be recommended to have AstraZeneca versus Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. In terms of AstraZeneca, obviously the biggest thing, as David said already, is fridge stable. And so fridge stable means we can get it anywhere. It's much easier for the distribution than the other vaccines we have. So, when we have it, we certainly will be using it. It's a question of where exactly. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is really interesting because it's even a single dose. And again, it's fridge stable as well. That single dose regimen, we showed is probably about 66% effective overall in preventing COVID and 85% in preventing moderate to severe. So they actually stratified between mild and moderate to severe symptoms in their study. The trial was done in the UK and South Africa primarily, and the efficacy was lower in South Africa. It's not totally clear why. We suspect it's related to the South African variant that's predominant there, but we don't actually have really solid data to say that for sure. So we're really looking to see what could be the reason for that at this point. It's important that there were no hospitalizations or deaths, so it is safe as the other vaccines we've seen so far. And this is one that, when it is available, we think is much easier to be used for the broad distribution, again, because it's a single dose, so we don't have to worry about those logistical concerns. Novavax is the one that's most recently been in the news. So they kind of just released their interim results, I think maybe last week or just in the last couple of days even. And it's looking pretty good. It's looking actually better than the AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson in terms of efficacy. So their interim results were 89% vaccine efficacy. They were able to do a little bit more sub-analysis in the UK, where they showed it was actually 96% efficacious against the previously circulating strain, but still 84% against the UK variant. And a lot of the cases in the UK had the variant, so we were able to get a really good analysis of this one. The South Africa results again showed similar decrease, again probably related to the South Africa variant. So it's something we're watching very closely to see how well these are going to manage the different variants that are coming up. Novavax announced recently that we'll be producing actually domestically in Canada, but that's probably not until near the end of 2021. We would hope to be getting vaccine before that point, before they're actually producing domestically, but it means that it is something that we'll have available. And just in terms of the dosing, so again, another fridge stable vaccine, which is wonderful, and this is 2-dose. So that's just a quick rapid fire summary of the ones that are coming down the pipeline in Canada very soon. We can pop to the next slide. This was just more for interest. So the Sputnik and the Sinovac, we don't expect to see these in Canada anytime soon, although they are being used in different regions around the world. Sputnik actually just published, I think it was 2 days ago, kind of interim results in the Lancet. And so we actually have some numbers on it. And it's looking pretty good, 91.6% in preventing moderate to severe infection. Their studies, given the population that it was basically all white men, more or less. So a little bit less generalizable, but it's, they've been using it in Russia broadly and some of the other post-Soviet countries, and so it seems to be working. Sinovac, we really have very little information. It's just kind of small news releases, more or less, on small numbers of participants. Other than that, it's 2-dose and sort of fridge temperature. Efficacy, you see a pretty broad range, somewhere in the 50 to 75%, but that's what's happening so far. We'll pop to the next slide. This is here just to give everybody another sense of what's happening in Canada. So this is all up on the Health Canada website in terms of the advanced purchase agreements that Canada has. And so this is how many vaccines we've purchased from all the different manufacturers, and just some key features about them. So, Pfizer and Moderna, obviously ones we have right now, we're awaiting additional doses on those ones. But you see AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Novavax, which actually has just recently been submitted for Health Canada, so is now under review in the status. It's all stuff that we're expecting to have soon. And again, so I think this goes back to that trickle to a flood comment that Liz made. We are in a trickle now. As we see more of these getting approved, and as we see, Pfizer's retooling their plant so they can make more product, as that goes through, we're going to see kind of a lot more vaccine coming, hopefully in a relatively short time. I'll say that relatively short time is not in the next month or two. We're probably expecting to have significant doses of vaccines closer to the end of spring or the summer, is when we'll start having a lot for more broad distribution, and that's the hope. But this is just to give everybody a general sense of what we're looking at. And as you can see from these numbers, certainly between all the advanced purchases, everybody in Canada should be able to get a dose. We have enough doses for everybody once they come in. It's a matter of them coming in. So I'll stop there and we can hop to questions.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I think that was really informative and answered a lot of questions that people have about the new vaccines, when they're coming, how they work, and how we need to figure out which ones we choose for which populations. So Brian, I think you can end the slides there. I'm conscious that, of the questions that you asked, we've dealt with the first 3, but there's still number 4 and 5 that we haven't dealt with. And so I want to make sure that I give our panelists a chance to respond to those. So a popular question people asked was, what data are being used to support extending the second dose interval to within 42 days? And what happens if the second dose is given beyond 42 days? So maybe I can turn it over to you, Daniel, to start answering that one.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. So obviously the studies only looked at shorter dosing regimens. They didn't look out to 42 days. The regimens in Pfizer and Moderna were generally between 19 days at the shortest and 28 days at the longest, which is why we're using those numbers for the recommended dosing. So NACI has reviewed the evidence, and so their suggestion is to go out to up to 42 days. And this is based, obviously not on direct evidence that we had available at the time of use in those regimens, but really more upon underlying principles that we know about vaccination and how the immune response works, that'd be reasonable to go out to 42 days. We are seeing provinces take a different approach and take even longer dosing schedules than that. So Quebec's up to, I think 12 weeks is what their suggestion was. I know the UK is doing, for some individuals up to 3 months out. we're definitely waiting to get more evidence from the jurisdictions that are doing those, that are taking those approaches. But at this point, with the vaccine we have available, it's a question of balance between, do we want to ensure that we have the best immune response possible for those who are getting vaccinated, or do we want to potentially have less efficacious vaccine response to get a higher number of people dosed earlier on? It's a wonderful question, and honestly, there's a lot of discussion going on at many tables about what the best approach is for that one. So I think that Ontario is following NACI with the 42 days, and I think that's reasonable and probably safest based on the evidence we have. But it's up for discussion, and as the evidence evolves, we'll see what happens. So to circle back to the question, what is the evidence we have for 42 days? Nothing specific in these vaccines to use 42 days exactly, but based on principles of immunization that we have seen in other vaccines.
Thanks, Daniel. And so another popular question that we received was about the effectiveness of the vaccines for the new variant. So you touched a little bit on this when you were speaking, Daniel, before, but maybe you could elaborate on the new variants and what we can expect with the vaccines.
Sure. So yeah, as I said, the ones that are in trials now that we talked about are showing decreased efficacy against some of the variant strains. We have by far the most data on the UK strain. South Africa, we're just starting to get data, and we're actually pretty limited in terms of Brazil, other than knowing what the genotype is. For the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, the initial evaluation done by the federal government and the National Microbiology Labs that we wouldn't expect significant decrease in efficacy versus the strains, just based on the mutations we know. So the way that the Pfizer Moderna mRNA was made for the spike protein that's expressed, the antigen binding site for the antibodies isn't directly by any of the known mutations. However, obviously we know that it's not going to be quite the same. So we expect a small decrease, and I think the study from the UK shows us kind of the best in terms of, it's probably about 5% to 8% lower vaccine efficacy for the variants. That still leaves us with a really good vaccine overall, right? Like 95% is wonderful. That's like the best vaccines that we have available. If we're down to 85 to 90, that's still a wonderful vaccine. So we are still looking at the evidence that comes out, but it's probably slightly less efficacious, but probably leaving us still with very good vaccines.
Thank you, Daniel. Did any other panelists wanted to jump in there about the new variants or the vaccine?
Sure, I can also just talk a little on the immunology side, because that's my jam. But I think that what what we're seeing with the lab-based studies, that initially came out and freaked everyone out. They were looking just on neutralizing antibodies, but that's only one part of your adaptive immune response. You also have your memory B and your memory T cells, and I think that's why it's really important to see whether, we see that translated in actual efficacy and effectiveness in participants in human trials. And I think that, what Dan was talking about was that, we haven't seen that drastic decreases in the efficacy, even with some of the more concerning variants such as the South African B1.351, because there are other components of your immune response that are beyond just your neutralizing antibodies itself.
Thanks, Sabina. And so if you guys haven't checked out the Unambiguous Science site, there actually is a great little infographic on the variants of concern, as well as I think an infographic that's either there now or will be up soon on the adenovirus vaccines that Daniel spoke about as well. So we're almost out of time, and I might just highlight a few questions from the Q&A. I think Jane Resnick has kind of made a comment there that many people are not realizing that symptoms that they may have COVID because of mild symptoms, and that we need more public health messaging to let people know that if they have mild symptoms, it still could be COVID, and that they need to go get tested. And I think all of us are seeing that, and hopefully that's something that we can urge our governments and public health colleagues to do, and we ourselves can do through our own media channels, radio, newspapers, social media. Sarah, I noticed that there was some comments about your consent form, and I just wondered if you wanted to just speak to the consent form you developed.
Yeah, certainly. So the slide that Michelle shared was just really the top portion of the consent. It actually has all of the questions that are included in the Ministry of Health consent form. And what's been really most helpful about that is stimulating the conversation. So from a convenience standpoint, what we hope is that when we have vaccine and can administer that in the clinic setting, that the process of obtaining consent will be much faster and people will have an experience of a convenient vaccination time. But what we have identified is that as people go through all of the boxes on the checklist, they're asking questions for themselves about whether their particular allergy counts as a serious allergy, whether their particular illness is one of worry, and that's allowed them to surface questions well in advance of being able to access the vaccine. And so we're booking brief phone appointments to address those questions as they arise and assure people about the safety of the vaccine in their instance. Or it allows us the opportunity to pursue the COVID-19 e-consult to ask questions of the allergists and immunologists who are available through e-consult so that we can have our own questions answered on behalf of our patients. Super helpful.
Thank you, and thanks for raising the issue about e-consult, Sarah. And so I noticed David Kaplan did put that detail in the Q&A as well for folks. But if you have a patient question about allergies, use the e-consult service, and I believe the ministry will be coming out with some more details on, you know, with the array of specialists that are available to answer your questions via e-consult around allergies. So just we're about to wrap up now, so I just wanted to highlight a few things. We're in the midst of the OCFP Family Medicine Summit, a new way to learn. So if you haven't already, please check it out. Next slide. I just wanted to highlight that our past webinars are available for self-learning, and if you haven't checked out these COVID-19 websites, please do so. They've got lots of great information. Next slide. And so if you've missed past sessions or your colleagues are interested in this session, it is accredited. If you go back and look at the video, all of the resources that we mentioned today, as well as the reporting, will be available on our website for you to view and are accredited as you do so. Next slide. And so lastly, I just wanted to highlight that our next community of practice will be 2 weeks from now on February 19th. We're thrilled that Trish Greenhall, who's a general practitioner, as well as a really world-renowned primary care researcher, is going to be joining us on that day. And she's published guidance on everything from long COVID to virtual care to masking, and has some really great insights from the UK that she'll be bringing. We'll be able to talk to her about the primary care's role in the UK around vaccine distribution and get her insights on a whole bunch of other topics as well. So please join us on February 19th. We'll be sending out the registration information shortly. And so thank you to our panelists for making this a fantastic session. Thank you to you, our audience, for being so engaged, and to everyone who is doing their part to keep our society safe and well. Thank you.